work of the and you present the work of the multi-stakeholder contact group. Rana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ajit. And I'm very happy to be with you, all of you today, to give you a quick overview of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network and the process of the production of this document and similar papers and documents that we have produced in the past. The Internet Jurisdiction Policy Network celebrates this year 10th anniversary, and it was established 10 years ago as a multi-stakeholder organization to address the tensions between the cross-border internet and national jurisdiction. As this is a huge topic, we have been focusing and working on three more specific areas, which are all quite large all by themselves. So the areas of online content, the area of domains, domain names, and the access to electronic evidence. As today's event is a product of the Content and Jurisdiction Program, I will focus on this. But the working methods and the philosophy behind the work of the three programs is pretty much the same. So the Content Program has been working on solutions to manage the global availability of online content in the light of the diversities of laws, norms, rules, and standards that are applicable on the internet. We are seeing relatively regularly governments around the world are increasingly legislating what content or behavior is legal or acceptable online. At the same time, internet companies or platforms are looking for ways to deal with content that they do not want on their platform, or which might be illegal or unacceptable in a particular jurisdiction. This is something that we are constantly and systematically monitoring, and you can see the results of this monitoring in the retrospect database, which a link will be posted in the chat briefly. And we also produce regular global and regional status reports on the status of internet jurisdiction around the world. This constant evolution of laws, regulations, is creating a very complex framework for global availability of online content. In the absence of international arrangements, we're seeing very little harmonization or coherence between numerous legislative proposals, rules, and regulations to address online abuses. This is also creating a situation where online behavior might be regulated by other states, directly or indirectly, so states where you might not be living, or by companies that operate from other countries or from other continents. As things currently stand, this all is likely to be a growing trend. And in this complex environment, there is a need for tools that enable or facilitate cooperation and harmonize due process mechanisms. The transparency framing brief, which we are presenting today, is just one such tool. You will find many others on our website, and the most comprehensive is the cross-border content moderation toolkit that we produced last year. So to develop these tools over the last 10 years, we have engaged over 400 experts from governments, internet companies, technical operators, civil society, academia, and international organizations. People from more than 70 countries coming together to frame issues, share knowledge, and develop operational solutions. The experts are divided into thematic contact groups composed of approximately 30 to 40 people from different stakeholder groups, where we are trying to also ensure gender and geographical balance. All the panelists that you see here in front of you today are members of the Content and Jurisdiction Contact Group. The contact groups are a safe space, allowing stakeholders to have freedom to explore different options and possibilities. At the beginning of each annual cycle of the contact groups, they decide on their priorities and create a work plan of things that they would like to develop. Based on an initial framing by the group, the Secretariat usually produces a first draft document for consideration and then further input by the group, and finally, adoption. Decisions in the contact group are made according to the notion of rough consensus, and the outcomes are voluntary and do not bind anybody's employers in any way at all. While we are far in this group from solving all the cross-jurisdictional challenges regarding online content, what we wanted to prove with the work of this group and these outcomes is that the process of multi-stakeholder internet governance is the best way to produce outcomes and results that will work for the benefit of all stakeholders. So this is what we're going to present to you today as the outcome on transparency, and I'll pass you back to Ajit.
Thanks, Prana. I'd also like to introduce Yulia Kalpokiene, who's the young professional at the Secretariat and supports the work across all the three thematic programs that I&J has. Yulia, I invite you to present the structure and the context around the framing brief on meaningful transparency. You have the floor.
Hello, everyone. And the framing brief offers a basic shared taxonomy and a set of structuring elements to aid the design, exploration, development, and implementation of meaningful transparency measures, informing both public and private actors of the components that need to be considered. It is important that the framing brief is not aimed at any particular actor. Rather, it is actor and regime agnostic. So in essence, the framing brief seeks to inform voluntary actions by platforms, self and co-regulation initiatives, and also statutory regulation efforts. And it is divided into 7 sections, highlighting key issues to be addressed by all involved in planning, establishing, and working on transparency. It is important, however, that despite those 7 sections being listed sequentially, they inform and feed into each other. So the idea is that these 7 elements have to be considered in the design and implementation of meaningful transparency regimes. But the order in which to do so is not prescribed. And it may well be that after considering several of the sections, one has to revisit one or several of the previous ones. So the framing brief offers a list of components that would need to be appropriately addressed in structuring any meaningful transparency regime. Moving on to the 7 sections, they are as follows. First, key purposes. And transparency serves a diversity of purposes, and any set of measures should ideally define clear objectives. In this section, 3 elements, namely ensuring predictability and trust, enabling oversight and accountability, and supporting analysis, identified as complementary and non-hierarchical dimensions within the scope of which the purposes of a meaningful transparency may fall. Second section is modalities, and transparency information can be provided or made available in different ways and be tailored to the needs of different audiences. And this section lists 5 modalities, which are not mutually exclusive, but each may need to be considered and curated in line with the key purposes. Just to give a flavor of the modalities, for example, decisions should be made on reporting, including frequency and format, also on availability of data, including what data and in what format would be made available, or to whom and on what basis. Next, the parameters section identifies 5 axes along which the scope of transparency is determined, of course, having regard to the purpose. It is important that it's not a decision either or, but it could be anywhere along the axis. So for example, whether the information is public or restricted, it's not one or the other. There may be different degrees of restriction, and the scope of recipients of the information may vary. Section 4 lists a number of potential burdens of a transparency regime. And this section is dedicated to the aspects that should be evaluated to ensure that the transparency measures provide value and empower stakeholders in due proportion of the burden that it places on them and relative to the risk of specific product or service. Section number 5 is counterbalancing interests, and it defines factors that need to be taken into account to ensure that the justified goals of transparency do not run contrary to other legitimate interests, such as security, privacy, or protection of sensitive business information. The next section deals with standardization. And while it lists a number of benefits, such as comparability or regulatory convergence, the limitations of efforts as standardization of transparency frameworks are also acknowledged. And then the last, but of course not least, is the section on frameworks, which emphasizes the need to decide when developing a transparency regime, what framework is the most appropriate, be it statutory regulations, self-regulation, or voluntary policies. So this is a brief outline of the structure of the document, and I invite you to download the document, and the link is provided in the chat. And also, please feel free to seek clarifications or ask questions in the Q&A pod.
Thanks, Julia. Maybe before we move on, if I could just ask you to shed some light on why this outcome was structured the way it was in 7 components, and if they're meant to be chronological.
Yeah, sure. As mentioned before, these sections in the framing brief are not intended to be considered in a chronological order, but they are all important elements when designing a meaningful transparency regime. So the structure starts with the main question, which is the purpose of transparency, and then it drills down section by section into different dimensions of implementation with a purpose in mind. So the starting point should be the purpose, but the other sections should be returned to over the course of designing the transparency regime. So these are all the elements that have to be appropriately addressed. But as said, the order in which to do so is not prescribed by the document.
Thanks, Julia. And thanks, Rana, for setting the scene for our discussion today. I think this is a great basis on which we can build upon in the panel. On that note, I'm very delighted to introduce our multi-stakeholder panel that is made up of Marielza Oliveira, who is the Director for Partnerships and Operation Program Monitoring for the Communications and Information Sector at UNESCO. We also have Peter Stern, who is the Director for Content Policy Stakeholder Engagement at Meta. We also have Guilherme Fitzgibbon Alves Pereira, Head of the Political Section for the Embassy of Brazil in Nairobi. We're also joined by Jason Pielemeyer, the Executive Director for the Global Network Initiative. Emma Lanso, who is the Director of the Free Expression Project at the Center of Democracy and Technology, will also be joining us shortly. She has a conflict and will be joining us towards the last 30 minutes of this discussion. In case you would like to know more about our speakers, you can find their brief bios on the event page for this webinar. So maybe to kick things off, I'd ask our panelists to maybe go around the virtual table and ask to share with us briefly what meaningful transparency means to you. And if you don't mind, Marielza, maybe I can start with you in terms of how you perceive meaningful transparency.
No, thank you very much. It's such a great pleasure to be here with all of you. So thanks for inviting me to the group and to the webinar. Well, for us, UNESCO works on the intersection of human rights elements as freedom of expression, access to information, and digital transformation. So for us, meaningful transparency is an enabler of human rights. And it's an enabler of human rights because it serves several purposes in ensuring that human rights are protected in the digital realm, including protecting people against hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, and so on. It's a tangible recognition by governments, internet companies, and actors of their legal and ethical obligations in protecting these rights. It generates evidence on which to determine whether these rights are, are being protected, including through content moderation and mediation elements that protect us against harms. It generates it increases our ability to provide due diligence and redress when these mechanisms are not being, sufficiently upheld. And it protects privacy when companies disclose the types of data they collect on people, how it's used and how it's transferred between platforms and so on. And finally, it gives researchers, public servants, and everyone the ability to understand the impacts of internet platforms on public discourse so that appropriate measures can be taken to protect the public interests. So it's an essential element of how we work in the digital realm. Thank you.
Thanks, Marielza. Maybe I could go to Peter next. Peter?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I really welcome the framing brief. I think I&J over the years has been very successful in developing a true multi-stakeholder approach. That is something that I think is easy to talk about and hard to do in practice. And I think I&J has really made great strides in that. In terms of meaningful transparency, internally, we are in the position of trying to prioritize and make decisions about where to devote resources and how to respond appropriately to the many types of requests that we receive from different communities, and also the types of steps that we want to take to align with our own values, including dignity and human rights. And we need a basis to have meaningful discussions with external stakeholders, which is something that we have done for many years. My team, I'm on the content policy team focused on stakeholder engagement. So this is really a core part of our work. But I have long felt that it would be useful to have a sort of shared vocabulary in this area. And I think that I&J has really helped to move the ball forward in that area by identifying the important reasons why we would want to have transparency, the very weighty values that transparency reflects, and the demands that it responds to. Also mindful of limits on transparency and burdens and potentially even risks that come with increasing transparency, and keeping these things in some kind of balance or tension, I think is difficult to do. And the framing brief, I think, is quite effective at that. So that's how I would approach meaningful transparency.
Thanks, Peter. Maybe turning to Guilherme now. What does meaningful transparency mean to you?
Thank you, Ajit. Thank you, I&J staff. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and thank you to the audience as well. Well, for those who don't know me, I'm a diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. So I'm participating in this in the I&J content jurisdiction group, from a point of view of the state policy-making perspective. And in this regard, as I see it, based on our experience and in Brazilian laws and in the internet sector, the best way I can describe transparency and meaningful transparency is through an analogy. If transparency by itself is having a window into the gears of a machine, meaningful transparency is the knowledge, is the wisdom and the experience required to understand how this machine works. Just looking at the gears is one thing. It's good for some purposes. States have to do it, have to provide this information. Companies also have to do it for regulatory purposes. But meaningful transparency should be understood, as I understand it, as a more coordinated set of informations, data, knowledge, experience, context, something a bit more structured. And I think that the framing brief really helps a lot for those entities that need to build a framework to provide transparency or to request transparency. The framing brief, as Peter has mentioned, provides a very nice common vocabulary, or common terminology for that. And I think it's a good place to start. Thank you.
Thanks, Guilherme. I could see that there were quite a lot of nods for your analogy, so I think it resonates with a lot of us. So maybe on that note, coming to you, Jason, how do you see meaningful transparency?
Thanks, Ajay. Yeah, thanks for the invitation, and it was a pleasure to be part of the contact group, working on this together with some of the speakers and others who are here as participants. I think of meaningful transparency, I think maybe the best way to kind of clarify at least my understanding and the understanding that we use, or maybe is reflective of kind of how we approach this in the Global Network Initiative context. GNI is a multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together companies, civil society, academics, and investors around free expression and privacy. And transparency is really baked into the set of commitments that GNI member companies and others undertake. I think maybe there's sort of a synonym to use for each word, and this was really, I think, building on Guilherme's analogy. I think, transparency can mean a lot of different things. I think in the context of what we're doing around human rights and sort of data and the digital ecosystem, I think of it as being somewhat synonymous with disclosure. I don't just mean disclosure in the sense of information being revealed, but information can be disclosed in any number of manners through any number of mediums and mechanisms. Where meaningful comes in is, to Guilherme's point, it provides the context to make that disclosure relevant and useful. And so I think the synonym that I would use there is really kind of utility, and there are many different types of utility that data and disclosure can service. From a civil society perspective, or a researcher perspective, or a government regulatory perspective, or a user perspective, right? And then there are probably many more other perspectives. So I think of it in that way. I think the qualifying adjective, whether it's meaningful or useful, is really important, because there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of information out there about this ecosystem and the relationships between actors and the ways that products and services interact in this space. But if it is not contextualized, if it is not developed in a way and connected to other information that's relevant, then it is at its best, just kind of sort of inert and not particularly helpful, and at its worst can be confusing or misleading or distracting, right, and sort of overwhelming. And so I really think the emphasis is on that qualifying adjective and what we mean by meaningful. I think that this briefing paper does a good job of framing out the purposes for that disclosure, and the potential, actors and circumstances in which that disclosure becomes relevant and impactful and useful. And for those reasons, I think it really is a helpful step forward.
Thanks, Jason. So maybe just a note to the audience: please feel free to use the Q&A pod to share your questions. We'll try to reserve some time at the end if there are questions. Otherwise, we will continue to have a discussion. So feel free to use the Q&A pod. So thank you very much to all the panelists for sharing your perspectives, particularly on the notion of the need for a shared vocabulary, and also actionable and information and knowledge. So building on these two concepts, if I could ask Marielza to elaborate from your perspective about the different uses of transparency and the different trends in transparency reporting that you have been observing, and contextualizing how this outcome could be useful in the current transparency landscape. Marielza, over to you.
Thank you, Ajit. Let's say that we see that since the rise of digital platforms, everyone really can benefit from robust transparency and accountability practices by internet platforms, because everyone is actually affected by it. But the thing is that we see that there is a great difference between the needs in different stakeholders, and this difference needs to be taken into account. So work that UNESCO does to protect human rights in digital spaces, is around the advocacy for greater transparency as a step to addressing other human rights challenges that exist in the digital realm, including the issues, of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation that are really, being affected tremendously by it. So, for us, without transparency, the human rights implications of the policies, the practices, and the algorithms of tech companies remain really difficult to us to really access. And for us, we see the that social media, while it connects us tremendously, it also remains perhaps a hostile and even discriminatory environment for many groups. Just as an example from our work on media, for our research with women journalists, for example, shows that 73% of them actually are exposed and experience online violence as part of their work. And it's the opacity of company policies that really facilitate that such dynamics happen, including algorithm amplification of discriminatory or hateful content. So it's really important to address these issues. So we've started addressing these issues, and the international community has mobilized for greater transparency around that. So, for example, in 2021, the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration was endorsed by UNESCO member states, calling exactly for internet companies to ensure transparency in relation to human rights and to human and automated systems, to provide robust notice and appeals and opportunities for users to conduct transparent human rights impact assessments, and engage in partnerships to support information as a public good. Because this is what we are looking at, information as a public good. So our work in this area is actually addressing these needs identified by member states. And in response to that, we developed a series of high-level principles on enhancing the transparency of internet platform companies. And those principles are set out in an issues brief we call the Let the Sun Shine In, that stresses that while internet companies do currently provide a lot of data in their transparency reporting, there's still significant gaps. They cover different issues and in a different way, which makes it very difficult for everyone to identify good practices and general trends around these issues. So the possible consultations that have been going on are important because they need to put these principles into concrete action, and so that we can develop standards and guides. So let me stop here by saying that we're really pleased to see this important effort and be part of this important effort, because this exactly enriches this global discussion, so that we have a real meaningful way to address these issues that need to be addressed, and identify, have the means to and the evidence to identify the trends and whether we are being effective in addressing this, the different harms and that can happen in digital spaces. So I'll stop here and we can continue later. Thanks.
Thanks, Maria-Elsa. I also see that Emma has joined us. Emma, thank you so much for joining us despite your conflict. We're just basically going through the panel discussion, and I'll come to you in a bit on meaningful transparency. But maybe at this note, if I could bring Peter in, particularly on two elements. First, from a regime perspective, what are the challenges in creating a transparency regime? And how does one, for that matter, a group, arrive at what are the relevant reporting criteria or metrics, given especially when different jurisdictions and stakeholders are involved? Secondly, I'd also be curious to hear from you about what you think are the challenges when it comes to statutory transparency reporting requirements and balancing that with the diversity of platforms and services they offer. I also see on the second point that there was a comment in the chat with regards to DSA. So again, it's up to you if you would like to address that as well, but the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I think those two questions in some ways are kind of adjacent to each other. I think that's another advantage of the framing brief. One thing that's noticeable when we look at the variety of stakeholders that we talk to, the variety of requests that we receive directed to transparency, is the quite varied landscape that exists across different countries, different types of stakeholders, and of course, different companies working with different sorts of products, each of which lends itself to different types of transparency, and in some fields, certain numbers, certain information about certain activities may be much more relevant than others. So we now have, I think, a better way to talk about all this. I do think it's important to keep sight of the ways in which legitimate requests for transparency may sometimes be in tension. We, for example, hear from different groups that have different levels of comfort about the providing of information that may have privacy implications or that may potentially create issues with authoritarian governments. And so we need to try to balance all these things, and rather than coming up with a template that people would seek to apply in each case, I think the framing brief gives us a set of tools that we can pick up and use as appropriate in a variety of different settings. So there are many different approaches that one might take, and I think we need to adopt a case-by-case response. In terms of governmental regulation, that is obviously something that's very much on our radar. And I think it's going to be quite a positive, is going to provide us with impetus and focus, both demands and protections, I think, when it comes to providing transparency. So rather than try to get into the specifics of any legislation, I would just say that we really, I think, welcome regulation that is crafted to provide a focus on systems and robust reporting around the removal of illegal content, and other types of core transparency issues that I think there's a broad consensus on.
Thanks, Peter. Maybe building on that, if I could ask Jason to briefly share with us how this framing brief would complement other work being done around meaningful transparency. And what trends do you see in transparency requirements, particularly from the perspective of regulatory and voluntary reporting?
Thanks, Ajit. So at the end of last year, the Danish government launched a Tech for Democracy initiative, which kicked off a year of action that is being primarily sort of implemented or carried out through a series of action coalitions on topics relevant to technology and democracy. And we've been working with a group of other stakeholders, including some who are part of the contact group and who are part of this conversation today, to put together something that we call the Action Coalition on Meaningful Transparency. So very appropriately themed and really focused on similar subject matter as this paper and this webinar. The idea behind that was acknowledging that there is a tremendous amount of work happening around transparency in the sort of digital space, work happening to sort of draw more insights into how governments are generating and affecting data, efforts to improve company transparency reporting, distinct work to facilitate researcher access to platform data, other initiatives more focused on particular subject matter areas and or content categories like advertising or the use of algorithms. A lot of really, really great work. Much of it, however, stovepiped in the sense that the experts or institutions that are leading these processes and engaged in them are not necessarily, and this is of course natural given everyone's bandwidth constraints, aware of or able to track progress in other areas that might be relevant, sometimes directly and sometimes more indirectly to the work they're doing. Similarly, most of the actors from what we have been able to map in these conversations and processes are Western, right? So a lot of Western governments, a lot of Western researchers and NGOs and academics, a lot of Western companies. Of course, we all know that most of, or at least some of the most acute impacts of the digital ecosystem are happening in non-Western contexts. And so the Action Coalition is intended to both provide an overall ecosystem kind of mapping to identify where there might be good opportunities for shared learning or collaboration, or where there could be gaps that need further attention, as well as to bring in voices from underrepresented geographies. So that's one effort in this space that is at kind of the meta level, so to speak, trying to really help facilitate information sharing among groups that are engaged on digital transparency. And we would welcome anyone who wants to be a part of that to join the Action Coalition. I'll put a link into the chat. We have a sign up page, and it is essentially an opportunity to be part of an email list to receive information, but also to share information with others about the work that you or your institutions might be engaged in. So it is, that's one effort. I think, GNI itself, as I mentioned, is also very engaged and has been for 14 years now on this question of how companies can be more transparent about their relationships, in particular with governments, responding to government data requests or censorship demands, but also just their overall relationships with the public sector. We do that in part through our internal assessment process, which creates a safe and confidential space for sharing information that, if released publicly, would potentially restrict the company's ability to protect their users' rights vis-a-vis governments, because it would, let the governments know sometimes the things that they may be doing to limit their compliance with overbroad demands. But it, at the same time, provides insight to civil society actors, to academics, to investors who are members of the GNI board, who look at these very detailed implementation, or we call them assessment reports. So I mentioned that just as an illustration of a mechanism that has been around for quite some time that facilitates disclosure, transparency, but in a way that is very contextualized, that is among experts and among a trusted group. And I think, referencing back to the question on the DSA, I think, there is a lot of room for these kinds, and some of the concerns that Peter mentioned, there's a lot of room for these kinds of creative opportunities for disclosure and collaboration. And we need to be open to thinking creatively about how we structure them so that we are addressing both the concerns about how data and information disclosure can be misused intentionally, or how it can have unintended consequences, as well as the need for greater contextualization and understanding, and facilitating not just awareness, but eventually collaboration around our shared objectives, which in this case, I think it's safe to say are the protection of users' digital rights.
Thanks, Jason. Maybe I'll turn to Emma now. Emma, we started by going around the table asking how the different panelists perceive meaningful transparency. So it'd be great to have your thoughts on that. But also building on that, if you could also sort of share with us how you think that this brief on meaningful transparency could be useful for advocacy concerning transparency from governments and platforms when it comes to online content.
Great, thank you so much, Judith, and apologies to everyone for arriving late, but it was great to even just catch this last couple minutes of the conversation. As far as what meaningful transparency means to me, I think this is something I'm sure other panelists spoke to, and Jason was just talking about in his comments. For me, it really is all about enabling people to understand what forces shape what they can see and what they can say on online services, and to understand what is potentially going to happen to their data or their speech if they use a particular service. That is not the entire end goal of all of the different transparency and accountability measures, but I really feel like that is core, that is at the heart of what I as an advocate and what I hope everyone as policymakers or people creating transparency initiatives within platforms can do and can think about, really helping make sure that at the end of the day, people understand what is happening to them online and what are their opportunities online. Because from there, we can build a lot of different kinds of accountability and advocacy measures if we think what's going on isn't exactly what users are looking for. So as far as how I think this framework can be helpful to advocacy in particular, I think they're in a lot of different ways. One is that I think it's really helpful the way that the framework lays out things like the different modalities and different parameters that transparency initiatives look at. I know as an advocate, I am often in conversations both with companies and with governments, particularly in the US and Europe, but also in multi-stakeholder environments or global kind of policy discussions, where at this point, everyone wants to do transparency. We all know transparency is a good thing. We want it. We want to pursue it in some way. But what does that mean? What does that look like? Having something like this framework really helps to give some common language for digging into the different modalities, for digging into the different kinds of things you might try to accomplish with a particular transparency initiative. My organization, the Center for Democracy and Technology, published our own framework for policymakers last December called Making Transparency Meaningful. Again, a lot of us coalescing around these same ideas at the same time, where we tried to lay out, for policymakers to understand that under the umbrella of transparency, there are many different things you might be talking about. You might be talking about transparency reports or operational reporting, kind of standardized aggregates reports coming out of companies. You might be talking about the kinds of notice and information that's given to users so they can understand what's happening specifically to their account or specifically to their posts. You might be talking about researcher access to data and trying to enable more independent researchers, journalists, advocates, academics around the world to be able to investigate questions about the information environment. You might be looking at actually auditing and assessment, which have a lot of commonalities with transparency, but are their own sort of field and own sort of dynamic. And being able to help people understand that as much as we might all want transparency, there are very different things we might want out of it, I think is a really, really useful kind of role for this framework to play. Another thing I would flag about the framework that I think is really useful is that it also discusses things like the burden that transparency can put on different entities, especially platforms, and also the counterbalancing interests and incentives around transparency. And I know a couple of the other panelists already talked about this, but understanding and laying out clearly that things like feasibility really matter. If a company doesn't have data, they can't share it, or they can't report on it, or they can't publish it. And that actually matters as far as what questions we might be asking in a transparency initiative. Understanding that if you put a really burdensome obligation to provide transparency on very small providers, you might actually be just shutting them out of the market and potentially exacerbating issues around competition in the tech space, is a really important thing for policymakers to understand, and to understand it not in the context of this is an explanation from a major tech company about why they don't want to be transparent, but to really understand that there is a really genuine set of concerns to think through about how you craft a transparency initiative to make sure that it doesn't have these unintended consequences. And then also say, just finally, from my seat as a human rights and freedom of expression advocate, we also, because transparency is such a sort of hot topic and such a common theme among so many different legislative and regulatory proceedings around the world, we see plenty that are very much focused on really wanting transparency for all the right reasons, for informing users, for enabling accountability and oversight of tech platforms, all of the positive things that I think a lot of us have talked about. But we do also see some actors using transparency initiatives as a pretext for other issues, whether it's for trying to obtain access to data that governments don't otherwise lawfully have access to, or to coerce certain kinds of content moderation decisions from social media platforms or other content hosts. We see a lot of creativity in some parts of the regulatory sphere, trying to kind of seek content restriction that they might not be able to get directly, or that wouldn't be politically feasible to obtain directly. And there are ways that transparency obligations can also be leveraged to those sorts of ends. So again, that's where I think what the transparency framework that the Internet and Jurisdiction Project has put out is really helpful for having a calm, kind of clear-eyed and very thoughtful explanation of what transparency can and can't accomplish and all of these different dynamics. And that helps advocates like me to have more of those kind of challenging conversations and push back when sometimes transparency is being used as a pretext to achieve other ends.
I think on that note, I'd like to bring in Guilherme on building on what Emma said, in a different way, in how you see the notion of transparency and standardization, particularly around its benefits and limitations. And I would also be curious to get your thoughts on how to make transparency meaningful for different stakeholders while counterbalancing their varied interests. Guilherme, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Ajit. And also continue a bit with what Emma was saying. I'm going to focus on two benefits and two limitations to transparency reporting, because it's a very long topic. We could spend another hour here just on that. On terms of benefits, I think if you report meaningful transparency properly, it can enable all the stakeholders in the internet environment, the users, the policymakers, the shareholders of a company, researchers on a specific topic. This could actually enable these people to evaluate proper criteria for either for decision making, for their own research purposes, or even within platforms or other companies, to even evolve their own practices inside for their own purposes. This depends on a certain level of standardization, which is one point that counts both as a benefit and a limitation. The framing brief is very clear. Has several items there on standardization, and when it is possible to apply it, it allows for a lot of more precise conclusions on what you're seeing. It allows for transparency to actually have meaning, or at least have meaning for other people when it is possible to compare one thing with another. Which brings me to another limitation of standardization. It's not a cure-all problem for transparency. Sometimes the standards for comparison between certain sets of data they're not either possible, or they're just not feasible for whatever reason. For example, it might be very difficult, if not impossible, to compare a report on content moderation between, let's say, Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Those are very different types of content. And even if you do have standards for each type of content, it's very difficult to compare those, at least for the moment, amongst themselves. And just the fact that you are applying standards to a transparency report doesn't necessarily mean that it can be meaningful. It has to be very well thought of. And just like Emma said, so, depending on looking from a policymaking perspective, if you impose very strict regulations for reporting requirements and transparency, you might be creating negative side effects, negative consequences for a market or for a research environment. Reporting on transparency, reporting on anything, and I say that with experience from reporting from freedom of information requests in the ministry, reporting is hard, it can be costly, and in terms of certain kinds of data, it can be very computationally taxing. So it takes time, it takes money, it takes brain power, and this might be a very heavy requirement for smaller service providers. Regarding the counterbalancing of several interests of stakeholders and how to make transparency useful for everyone, the funny thing about the internet is that all of us here, or at least most of us at least, we are stakeholders with two faces. We are both individual citizens and we are also representatives of our respective entities. So we are speaking with two voices. And as such, we both have different roles, different rights, different duties as stakeholders whenever we want to require some sort of information from one entity or one actor or another. Counterbalancing the interests of these different stakeholders is simultaneously something mathematical, because, and I'd say that quote unquote, because regulation determines certain very hard limits. For example, minimum number of users that a social network has to have to report on certain conditions. If they have more than said number of users, then they have to report this and this and this and that. If they don't, they just have a simple report and all that. But once you get inside these limits, it's a bit of an art on how you actually calibrate the protection of certain greater human rights, like I think Jason and Peter were mentioning, such as privacy or intellectual property or freedom of expression, or even national security in some extreme cases. You have to regulate that with the reporting requirements and the duties that such reports have to provide. I mean, the public interest information that this report has to provide to the other stakeholders. It's a difficult act to balance, and it's pretty much an art. It's something that we don't have a unique solution for. The framing brief provides us with tools, but it cannot and should not, I think, provide us with a single one-stop shop solution. And finally, meaningful transparency is useful when it takes into consideration these roles and the rights of all the stakeholders involved, to ensure that any information that is required from one stakeholder by another, whichever one that is, be it, for example, a platform requiring a specific information from a user, or a government requiring information from a conglomerate of companies. This shouldn't impose on any of the parts involved any undue stress or any violation or abuse of rights. The request needs to be proportional to the capacities of each stakeholder, and whenever possible, it should be presented with I'm going to call this added value to make it meaningful, to make it worthwhile to the context in which it was requested. Of course, this is all a work in progress for all of us, for governments, for companies, for users. We are all learning as we go. But it's good that we now have a starting point for that with the framing brief. Thank you.
Thanks, Guilherme. I'm conscious of the time, so maybe I'll turn to Frana quickly to basically give us his thoughts, particularly also on the angle of implementation for regulatory regimes. And I also see that we have two questions in the Q&A pod. So Frana, over to you.
Thanks, Ajit. I will leave the two questions in the Q&A for the panelists to have a look at and address, which are very interesting. But one question which was asked in the chat from Helena Schwertheim regarding the Digital Services Act, and I think to summarize your question is, what are the challenges that are not addressed by the Digital Services Act, and what do we think about it? I think, first of all, Emma's organization produced, I remember, a very useful document looking at the different levels of transparency reporting at the DSA. So maybe Emma, if you want to post that in the chat. But what is clear is that a framework like the Digital Services Act will create the basis for many issues with regards to online regulation, including transparency, but the details of this will need to be worked out as in the implementation. And that's going to be one of the big challenges, because while there are broad elements there which are set out, and I think our document could be helpful in looking at what could be, which elements could be meaningful for which stakeholders, how to address the issue of different sizes of the different platforms, how to address the competing interests between the different stakeholders here. The challenge will be, and if you look at the Digital Services Act, the interesting thing is it's a piece of legislation which is going to be implemented across 27 jurisdictions. So from the international jurisdiction kind of concept of that we should find tools together, this is extremely useful, but the details will need to be worked out, I think, by the regulators. And this is going to be a very big challenge, and it's going to be interesting also, I think, to look at to what extent there will be a multi-stakeholder approach in developing these tools in order for implementation to be helpful and, as we say here, meaningful for all the different stakeholders in here. So I think that's an important element to ensure that the implementation also of any legislation also takes into account a multi-stakeholder perspective as well.
Thanks, Rana. I see, Marietta, you have raised your hand, so you have the floor.
No, thank you. It's just that, we're talking a lot about the issues of regulation and about the different the ways of establishing regimes, on transparency. And I'll just say that, give you a heads up that in February 2023, next year, UNESCO is going to be organizing a conference hosted by UNESCO on regulation of digital platforms. And we're not going to be looking only at regulation in terms of government regulation, but the various ways in which regulation actually happens, from self-regulation, including in terms of service, to co-regulation, to new elements such as sandboxes and innovations around that. I think the issue of transparency will definitely be a major key theme in the conference that we host. So let me extend an invitation to you, to all of you here, to actually participate in this process. And I'll be happy for us to actually organize a session in which we can bring around, the discussions inspired by the meaningful transparency brief that was just put together, because it's really, it articulates very well the different elements that we need to consider. And I think it would be a great start for exactly this type of multi-stakeholder consideration that we need to have. So here is an invitation for that. And we can be in touch later, to discuss how we can work on that together. Thank you.
Thanks, Marielza. I don't see any other questions at the moment. So there's one that's just come up in the chat. Frana, do you want to take it?
I'm literally just reading it. So would you say that the meaningful transparency may successfully safeguard human rights in an era where regulatory paradigm is becoming more and more data-centric? I think that's to an extent the point of the document that we try to produce here, is to try and find a way to safeguard human rights, because essentially transparency is also an important tool in safeguarding human rights. To know what is happening, you need to know what are the key important elements in different areas of platform activities of governance. So that's an important, now whether it's more data-centric or not, that's a different issue. How do you perceive it? But I think that's why we start with the concept of what is meaningful to whom. How do you define different areas of transparency for different stakeholders? So if your goal is to protect human rights, to find the elements which could be damaging to human rights, it's important to have this conversation at the outset when the transparency elements are being developed. And this is something, again, maybe it wasn't highlighted strongly enough, is that we are trying to look at transparency from different levels. There is the regulatory transparency, so where the governments are putting out legislation, but there's also voluntary transparency by companies which are putting out a lot of information. So how do you define what's important to put into legislation? How do you define what is important to put into voluntary practices, codes of practices? It could be individual companies, it could be groups of companies coming together. There are all the different elements, but it's important to think about, again, what is it useful and meaningful to those to achieve a particular purpose? What is your purpose in the end?
Thanks, Prana. So just again, conscious of time, maybe I could ask everybody to sort of just give their closing remarks of how they would see this document being useful, or how the attendees for the webinar might actually be able to use this. So very briefly, if we could probably start with maybe Marielza and then go to Peter, Emma, Jason, and then Guillermo. Marielza?
No, I think this document is an essential conversation piece for us to really articulate what needs to be done around transparency. I refer back to people who mentioned that we needed a common language, and we start by saying that we don't even have a definition of transparency in which we all agree upon, let alone the different types of indicators that would actually, or the disclosures that would actually be elements that we need to organize around that. So, I mean, the fact that we have a document that really articulates all the considerations that we have to take into account in order to really arrive at this collective understanding is exceptional and a great achievement. And I really congratulate the network for having, put it together. We are going to be using it very well, and in a lot of different parts. And I already invited you to the conference next year, where I think this could be a major centerpiece for this dialogue. So thank you.
Thanks, Ajit. Shall I pick up? Yeah, this has been a very interesting and useful discussion, and I also look forward to using the framing brief. I think there's an interesting set of questions buried in here from the platform side about how to convey transparency to the people who really want to hear about it. If we take Guillermo's notion of making the gears sensible and explaining how the gears work, there's a lot to that. Partly it's releasing data, but partly it's providing explanations that people can absorb. And my team, my stakeholder engagement team, does a lot going out and talking to NGOs and other stakeholders to try and flesh this out. I remember at a conference many years ago, Emma, you probably forgot about this, but I remember this. I really took this to heart. You said that transparency has to function at multiple different levels for stakeholders with different bases of knowledge and expectations. And I think that's exactly right. So my hope would be that as we continue to tackle that difficult set of problems, the I&J document can be of use.
Well, and I'll chime in and say that I think one really practical way this document can be of use is for anybody who's considering a transparency initiative, whether it's from the company side, an advocacy campaign, or a proposal for legislation or regulation. I think taking a look at whatever that concept or idea is and walking through the framing brief and looking like, is it clear what the parameters of this proposal are? What modality, what kind of information are we actually trying to get? What are the counterbalancing interests? It can be, in a way, it's not going to answer those questions for you, but it can certainly be a kind of checklist for understanding, have you thought through all of the different components, and sort of, can you place a particular transparency initiative within this framing? That I think will help everybody sort of make sure that they are really thinking about the full context of what they're proposing around transparency, and make sure that some of the difficult questions that have already been raised, or some of the issues where we don't need to reinvent the wheel, you can kind of anticipate some of those, I think, by using this brief.
Thanks, Emma. Jason and then Guillermo. Jason, do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not a whole lot more to say other than that I think this brief will be really useful for our work with the Action Coalition as a kind of framing document that really does a nice job of sort of articulating some of these use cases, but also some of these questions and challenges when it comes to thinking about the larger transparency ecosystem. So we're really pleased with it, and we have had good conversations with the I&J team and look forward to further ones and continue to invite anyone who's interested in signing up for the Action Coalition with the link that I have previously put in the chat. So hopefully we'll continue these conversations both through I&J and in that context as well.
Oh, my turn for the last one. Well, from the policymaking perspective, the framing brief is very useful in the sense that it provides us the specific tracks in which we should be looking for to not just to as a government to provide information to citizens, but also as a regulator to ask information from the private sector or from other stakeholders, and also to provide which rights and duties are applicable to regular citizens as rights holders and to companies themselves. There's a very broad, a very vast list of indices and other criteria that we can use to evaluate meaningful transparency. So in that regard, the policy brief is a very welcome step for us to not just to evaluate this within our own governments, but also to discuss like Maria also said, in UNESCO or the OECD or in other international organizations and fora, how meaningful transparency can have an impact globally as well. We understand that this can be a very pertinent discussion, not just in the future. Right now, this is going to show up, and I hope this can be of use to all government officials in Brazil or in Latin America and elsewhere. I'm very glad to have been a part of this anyway.
Thanks, Guilherme. I'm conscious of the time and that we're 3 minutes over the time. So I wanted to thank everybody who's attended, but also thank the panelists for taking the time out to be here today, but also thank the contact group. This framing brief is not a secretariat outcome, but it's the collective intelligence of about 40+ experts from the contact group. So this is really a community product, and we're really grateful for the commitment of the contact group members, both in their time and their expertise in the production of this outcome and the other outcomes. I'd also just like to sort of point out a point that Bertrand has made in the question with regards to measuring meaningfulness and the need for ongoing multi-stakeholder discussion around implementation. So that's another important point to keep for us to continue working on and be an element to facilitate other initiatives that work in that space. So thank you very much for joining today, and we're very grateful for your participation. The Secretariat will stick around if anybody wants to have a chat. But again, you don't feel obliged to stay, and thank you very much for joining. Bye-bye. Thank you.
The only question is, are we still alive in the web webinar?
So we can, if anybody wants to stay, if you can raise your hand, and we'll sort of promote you to the panelists, and we can have a chat if you like. Maybe if I could ask one of the co-hosts, let Bertrand to promote Bertrand into the panel, that would be great.
Natalia, if you would be so kind. I'm not
yes, sure. I just did.
Okay.
Let's see for a few more minutes. So
happy to join.
If there are others who are still here, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll promote you to being a panelist. But I don't see any hands at the moment. Or put your name in the chat as well, and we'd be happy to bring you on. I didn't see any hands or elements for people asking to come in. So thank you for joining, everybody. I hope it was a good conversation, and I hope we did justice to the framing brief.
Definitely.
Yeah.
we could spend hours and hours and hours on this. It's a never-ending topic anyway.
I really like your analogy, Guilherme. I think that's a pretty interesting. It's sort of almost the manual of how a particular machine functions. So yeah, so it's interesting.
So should we then close the webinar function? I think, since nobody has raised their hand. Natalia, if you'd be so kind.
Yes, okay, so I will end the meeting, right?
Oh, okay.
Not the meeting, we want to stay in the room, but can you, I think,
Then I will just remove the participants.
okay, thank you, participants.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Not sure if Susan is still here. Hi, Susan, are you still there? You could respond in the chat. Also an interesting sort of conundrum because you don't have that consent to sort of bring them on to a panel either. So you don't know how people are joining the different webinars.
Good.
Yeah, okay. We could also maybe stop the recording and then we can